This is my book, Dazzle Patterns, and it came out in 2017. And I know some of you have read it and maybe have been to the reading that I gave my launch here. And that was just a great event. It was so nice to launch the book here. So I thought that what I would do is just reiterate again what the book was about. Because to me, it was about three things: art, love, and war. And I named it Dazzle Patterns for the idea of dazzle patterns, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, because it's something that can operate. You can take it literally, but it also operates on many levels in the book, because the book is also about vision, inner and outer vision, and that's kind of where the art part comes into. So I thought I'll kind of wrap up talking about dazzle patterns in general at the end. And there's three characters in the book. There's a woman who works in a glass factory. She's the main protagonist, Claire, and she loses an eye in the Halifax explosion. The book starts with the Halifax explosion. And then there's a German glass crafter named Fred, who immigrated to Canada when he was quite young. And so he's caught up in the events of Halifax as well. And then there's Claire's fiance, who is a childhood friend, who grew up with her in rural Nova Scotia. And he's on the front in France. So that's the war part. And there are three kind of narratives interbraid through the book, and it is, I guess, a love story, a love triangle story. I almost said a ménage à trois. No, it's a love triangle, and it really takes place in the year after the Halifax explosion. So the explosion was December 6th, 1917. And then by the next December, the war is over. And so it's about, what happens to each of those characters in that year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about illness, though, too, because the virus, the Spanish flu, actually appears in the book, because you can't write about that period of time. That year was the two second and big outbreaks of the Spanish flu were in 1918. So one of the characters in France dies because of the Spanish flu, and of course it was really just kind of fomented on the battlefields in Europe. It was interesting. I was reviewing the origins of the Spanish flu name, and what happened is, when it started to break out in the war, on the war fields, there was a lot of censorship to keep morale up in all the countries that were involved in the battlefield, in the battles, and so the only country that was really covered as far as the news of this illness arising was Spain, because they were neutral. And so it was assumed that that's where the major outbreak was, and that's why it was called the Spanish flu. I didn't know that. Anyways, it was a huge part of the mortality involved with the war, because it's pretty much understood that it wouldn't have been as deadly if not for the conditions of World War I, where people were under condition, and the men were gathered together in these big wartime hospitals, where the most virulent forms of the flu were selected for. So apparently, normally mild forms of flu are selected for, because the people who are really sick stay home, and the people that go out into public have a mild form, because they're managing to get through their day-to-day life. And so in the war, the First World War, it was flipped around, and the men with mild forms were still fighting. And then the sick men were all gathered together in these massive hospitals where the flu just took off. So I just thought it's kind of interesting, you know, because this period of time we're going through is often compared to one, war, and two, compared to the idea of the Spanish flu. And in both ways, there are similarities and differences. It's a different kind of virus from the Spanish flu, which was actually an H1N1 virus. But also, it is different from war in that, you know, war, of course, has a real enemy, and we are dealing with an invisible enemy, and war divides peoples. And I think what's really interesting is that this experience is really uniting everybody globally and reminding us how connected we are. And I don't think, well, there's never been a pandemic with so much connection before. So, you know, the Spanish flu was it touched practically every country in the world because there was travel back and forth, and it was exacerbated by the war. But it's interesting how the idea of connection has been deepened, I think, by the experience that we're going through now. And not only because we're so connected globally through travel and trade, but also because everybody's going through the same thing. You know, we're all suffering the same kinds of outbreak. It doesn't really seem to be very different from place to place. And so I just, I think from a research point of view, that's kind of interesting to compare and contrast the two time periods and the two kinds of viruses. There's a great article in The Last Walrus called Anatomy of a Pandemic by my friend Kevin Patterson, who's a doctor and a writer, and he actually did a very nice blurb for me on the back of my book. And anyway, it's a really great article with the whole perspective of Spanish flu, what we're going through now, how they're similar, how they're different, and just the idea of pandemics in general in human history. So I thought I'd read just a little bit on I call this the weapons of waiting. So the kind of comparing the the idea that war is similar to a pandemic in a way, because people are forced to just wait and live with the unknown. So Claire, the protagonist, wakes in the night often, and she's dealing with visions. It says her habit in these dark hours was to think about Leo, that's her fiance. But tonight the memories she had sipped on like honey, topping up her daily longing for him, feeding her plans to go to him, tasted bitter. There would be no more letters to write or to look for in the mail. Leo is missing. A great emptiness rose into the room, stifling the oxygen, making it hard to breathe. Leo was gone. The war had been something to cross over, a trek to the other side, where their new lives would begin. The war in Europe ground on in the trenches. At home, it was fought with the weapons of waiting. Hope, blind faith, superstition. For Claire, the waiting was over. Waiting had become her habit, an instrument that she had had to learn to master, to continue the small tasks of day-to-day living. Now she plucked at vacant air. So it's just the idea that we're all kind of in a waiting room is a little bit similar to how the war is fought by those left at home. Yeah, so I thought I would also read briefly from a scene where one of the characters dies. There's a bit of a spoiler alert. Has anyone not read the book? Put up your hand if you haven't read the book. Anybody? I'm scanning the faces. Thanks for coming, everyone. Wow. Well, one of the characters falls ill with the Spanish flu. It had struck the village in the spring. This is in France, taking a few sickly babies and old ones with it. And just as an aside, another kind of interesting difference between the virus we're dealing with now and the Spanish flu was that it, for some reason, took people in middle life, so the 20s and to 40s, which is really unusual. Like flus generally take the young and the very old, and this virus is no different. Although the young seem to be quite immune to it, it's mainly the elderly. But the Spanish flu took the young and healthy too. Over the summer, it had gathered strength. More and more men were brought to the hospital each day with influenza. First, they complained of terrible headaches and high fever. Some recovered, but for many, the only thing the nurses and women from the village could do was wipe them down with cool water and catch the vomit and the blood, thick with foam, that they coughed up as their lungs filled with fluid. So this character, Natalie, is going to help with the men. When Natalie returned home at the end of one day, she sank into a chair in front of the fire beside Lucien, her father. Coming in from picking the last apples, Leo, that's Claire's fiance, who is living with Natalie and her father, found the two of them dozing. She woke with a start at the sound of the door hinges. Leo recognized the haunted look on her face. It was the look he had seen in the trenches, men waking from one nightmare into another. So she's starting to see men dying in the hospitals where she's helping. But that's all very serious. The other thing that the book is about is art. And I set the book, a good part of the book, at least what happens to Claire especially, in the School of Art in Halifax. And the director of that School of Art was Arthur Lismer, who some of his most famous paintings are Dazzle Patterns, Ships and Dazzle Patterns. He was a war artist at home, and he would go down to the harbor, which was filled with the ships of war coming and going, taking men and supplies to the war. And so some of his most well-known paintings from that time are of the ships in Dazzle Pattern. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, the character Claire, who has lost an eye and has had terrible visions, which are kind of a symptom, can be a symptom of losing vision. She kind of has hallucinations. And in order to cope with these, she finds what relieves her is to draw and paint. So, and she eventually becomes quite absorbed in becoming an artist, and she attends the art school. Some of you may remember this scene, but there's